Can Freud be trusted? I won't give you a direct answer to that question, since only you can decide which person is worth trusting. But I can shed some light on whether his psychoanalysis is a scientific discipline or not. I have noticed that quite a large number of people who are only superficially familiar with psychology sincerely believe that psychoanalysis is a science. And in general, psychoanalyst sounds so cool, right? But as you may have already guessed, there are problems with its scientific validity. Actually, let's turn to Freud's theory, or rather his many theories. In order for you to intuitively assess their level of scientific validity, I suggest quickly going through this image. Here we can see that Freud began his ascent to the Olympus of psychological fame with his first personality theory in 1905. Here he introduced the concepts of the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And by the way, I would like to emphasize the concept of the unconscious, because many people use the word subconscious, but this is incorrect. In fact, in psychoanalytic theory, it is correct to say unconscious. Next, of course, you have heard of Freud's theory of psychosexual development, which includes oral, anal, phallic, latent and genital stages. Yeah, it's all about the same thing. And perhaps his most famous theory is the structural theory of personality. Here he introduced three components of personality: the id, ego and superego, which, roughly summarized, correspond to our animal instincts, passions, etc., our rationality or thinking, and the superego is responsible for spirituality, morality and things like that. You have also surely heard of the Oedipus complex. Here he developed concepts of unconscious urges and attractions towards our relatives. And Freud also made a name for himself in dream interpretation. He distinguished between explicit content in our dreams, implicit content, and used free association to analyze them. In this video I won't bore you with explanations of what he meant by these terms, but we'll move straight to the question of whether his psychoanalysis is scientific. For many, this question is not so obvious. Well, many of us, I'm sure, even tried to diagnose some people based on so-called everyday psychoanalysis. Sort of, he was probably beaten by his father as a child, so now he compensates by taking out his aggression on his children. Here, one of the mechanisms of coping with neurosis, according to Freud, is mentioned: compensation. Also, we can see the search for a connection between a person's current situation and their personal history. The very typical psychoanalytical digging. And of course, a qualified psychoanalyst may well take up the case and give us their more elaborate opinion, deftly juggling impressive terminology. However, how will you perceive the opinion of a psychoanalyst if I tell you that Freud's entire psychoanalysis is not a scientific theory? No, not because I said so, but according to the famous Karl Popper, who formulated one of the most famous criteria of scientific rationality: the principle of falsifiability. Falsifiability? Who would invent such a word? According to this principle, a scientific theory must be falsifiable. In other words, if any observation coincides or agrees with a theory, then the theory is weak. In order to claim to be scientific, a theory must indicate which observations or data could refute it, and which would confirm it. As you may have guessed, Freud's theories, any theory of his, are so vague and allow for so many interpretations that no matter what happens, no matter how someone behaves, it is always possible to formulate why this behavior or experience is consistent with psychoanalytic theory. Therefore, unfortunately, psychoanalysis is not a scientific theory among the array of theories related to the field of psychology. However, to be fair, it is worth noting that some modern psychoanalysts do not give up attempts to provide some scientific evidence base for psychoanalysis. For example, one of the most famous defenders of psychoanalysis, Peter Fonagy, has conducted a series of his own studies, which, according to him, confirmed the effectiveness of psychoanalytic techniques, but his work has been heavily criticized. Canadian psychiatrist and professor Joel Paris, in one of his relatively recent works, examined publications dedicated to Freudian psychoanalysis. Among these publications were also several by Peter Fonagy. In particular, after analyzing the methods used by the psychoanalyst, Paris concluded that these methods are not psychoanalytic, in the classical sense of the word, but represent a mixture of modern psychodynamic methods and standard cognitive behavioral interventions adapted for severely ill patients whom Fonagy was working with. Accordingly, his results in no way support the efficacy of Freud's psychoanalysis. Although this doesn't mean that psychoanalysis is a completely useless thing. In fact, its historical significance is hard to overestimate. It was psychoanalysis that triggered the rethinking and deeper study of unconscious processes that form an important part of, for example, neuropsychology and the psychology of learning. So guys, don't forget to hit that like button and I'll see you in the next video.